Alright, me. It's the same day, and in honor of the Packers wildcard game tonight, I finished reading. I started and finished reading Jerry Kramer's Instant Replay. Um, I believe this is the last sports book that I have of some sort, so it might be another like 3 years before I read another sports thing. But certainly I have, as evidenced by what I've read, a certain mystique and enjoyment out of this specific era, and specifically the Green Bay Packers of this specific era. Certainly a lot of that has to do with my father, and just the mystique of that time period in professional football. And I think this book by Jerry Kramer does a great deal of expressing that in a lot of ways. This is a collection of diary entries, effectively, by Jerry Kramer, and then was edited by Dick Schaap. And diary entries in the sense of effectively what I'm doing now, of where he would have tapes of himself and just record what was happening throughout certain days and certain weeks. And then Dick Schaap got all those tapes and then edited them, right? Took out what was considered to be important, made sure that they were formatted in a way that made sense, and things like that. This book is really famous for one big thing, which is that after this was made during the second Super Bowl of the Packers, right? So it's the third championship, second Super Bowl that the Packers win in a row. And it's like, I think the 6th in 10 years, or like the 5th in 8 years, or something like that. And famously, as it turned out, because of the way that he was writing this book, Jerry Kramer had a taping of the last two speeches that Vince Lombardi ended up giving to the Green Bay Packers, which is kind of these wild things of like, it's when you're looking at something like sports in an entertainment fashion, right? Something like that of the mystique of Vince Lombardi, right? The championship that the United States' largest sports league competes for is named after him, right? And having on tape the last bits of what ended up being his crowning achievement in so many ways, right? That's kind of a wild thing to have. But yeah. The book itself, I mean, I don't necessarily have much to say on the book itself, right? It is what I kind of expect from, and what I think everyone kind of expects from someone who is playing professional sports while talking about professional sports, of where it's written in this very frenetic style, right? It is, which is much like, any sports league, professional sports league, of where, yes, it is organized in the sense of like, you have a schedule that is given to you and handed to you. You have meetings at very specific times. You have games at very specific times. You have these routines, but at the same time, it is so constant, and going. You're traveling for 12 to 13 weeks out of the year constantly. So, it's just very written in this very frenetic way. It's not like locker room talk kind of deal, but it is very much like a right this overall sense of camaraderie that exists right between people who are playing a sport together. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it even leads more so into that sense because of who Jerry Kramer is, right? I think a lot of sports biographies and discussion about things focuses around either certain positions or certain star players, and therefore that is also who really publishes biographies, right? And instead, in this one, we get the biography of someone who is incredibly important and means a lot to this team, but is also nobody, right? It's Jerry Kramer. I mean, he plays 10 or 11 years in the NFL. He makes an all-pro team like 6 or 7 years. He makes like 4 or 5 I think 3 or 4 pro bowls. He is the starting guard for all of these Packer teams that are like, in general considered to be some of the greatest teams in history. One of these, true great dynasties, yada, 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 yada. And he's starting for all of them. And then he doesn't get elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame until like 2017, 2018, 2019, somewhere in that range. Right? And it's because he's playing this position that gets no credit for what it is, right? It would be like, I can't even come up with a really good, but it'd be like having a biography on Michael Jordan and the 90s Bulls, but it's written by, Luke Longley or like Will Perdue or something, or like, a biography on the Murderers Row Yankees, but it's written by, their, fourth reliever that's in their minor league system kind of deal, right? Or it's playing independently that plays, maybe a handful of games with them, and it's just this very, very interesting thing of where, like, I can't think of another sport where someone or players that do so much get so little attention, right? So yeah, fascinating stuff. But yeah. A great deal of this book is also about Jerry Kramer and finances, right? Which makes sense. It's another one of these things that where, because he's playing a position that's not marketed and therefore is not given a lot of attention, he's making way less money than he probably should be just because of the position that he plays, right? And so there's a huge focus on this of where he's trying to balance, the rigors of what is expected out of him in terms of football, as well as trying to set himself up for all of these. He's thinking about retiring for most of the book. He will retire after the next season, I think. And so much of it is about like, I got to think about what I'm doing after this, right? And and that just bleeds over into so much of what he's doing, because he's constantly going immediately from practices or immediately from games to then deal with business stuff or host a syndicated TV show. Even this book is sponsored, right? It's sponsored by a razor company, right? That's fascinating because it's so it speaks to a world and to a system that is not quite caught up with the capitalistic intents of what it is, right? And so, you know, you're looking at some fascinating things of he's discussing like salaries and numbers and things. He ends getting paid like 17.5 to like $19,500 for the season. I don't know what that is in current money, but then he's going and talking with, you know, people about what their salaries are, and one of these running backs that has replaced Paul Hornung is talking about this photo shoot that he got that they're paying him $7,000 for, and Jerry Kramer's like, I just got offered one for $30. Are you kidding me? There's also a little bit of attention focused to one of the guys that ends up being on their, they call it the taxi team, but effectively like the practice squad. And he's making like $100,000, while Jerry Kramer is asked to be in this incredibly difficult position that gets no credit, and he's getting paid effectively a fifth of what someone who's on the practice squad is making, right? So yeah. There's a great deal that's also focused on Vince Lombardi, which makes sense. Vince Lombardi sells. You know, there's a lot of things that would definitely not work in the modern NFL and the way that we experience it that made Vince Lombardi who he was. Yada. There's also two other people that I think I specifically need to talk about that Jerry Kramer gives a lot of attention to. And one of them is a guy called Dick Arndt, who was kind of one of these like last guys to be on the Packers before their final preseason cuts. And Dick Arndt grew up with Jerry Kramer in the terms of like grew up in the same small Idaho town. Was like, I think as described, like when Kramer started playing, I think it was like either when Kramer started playing professionally or when he was starting college, that this Dick Arndt was in like the 8th grade, and then eventually won the award named after Jerry Kramer in this high school, right? And so he spends a good amount of time talking about Dick Arndt, and Dick Arndt would eventually play, like 4 or 5 years in the NFL and do, semi-successfully, but would instead spend most of the time with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think it was what it was. The other guy that gets a lot of attention to this and is a much sadder story is a guy called Travis Williams, who basically gets no credit for that last Super Bowl. The Packers at the time, Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung at this time, I think, were both down in New Orleans and with the Saints, because Jim got paid big money to go there, I believe, and then Paul Hornung was selected in the expansion draft, if I remember. And so, Travis Williams is like one of these really young running backs that gets asked to fill these massive positions. And he ends up being kind of like a kick return specialist type guy. He held the record for the most kick returns for touchdowns for years, for like decades, because he had 4 this year in 67. And then and there's so much of this book that's focused on Travis Williams. A lot of it is on Travis Williams' struggles, and then eventually gets to, you know, these issues with the running back position and things like that. And then, you know, in the famous Ice Bowl game, which is also part of this season, of where Travis Williams ends up barely playing anything, and a different running back takes like all the snaps. And then we get to, if you then look up who Travis Williams is and what happened to him, it's horrifically sad. Travis Williams ends up playing another couple years of the NFL, mostly for the Packers, and then eventually is traded to the Rams and plays like half a season for the Rams, and then his knee gets blown out, and then he just never plays again. And I think he eventually died at age 45 due to alcoholism, complications of alcoholism, and like spent much of his life homeless, or being arrested. And it's this very tragic story of someone who, Jerry Kramer always mentions that he thinks that Travis Williams could be the next Jim Brown, only to have that person, because of an injury at a point in time in which, you know, no treatment was guaranteed towards players if they were not on the team, and then just his life falling apart, right, is tragic. And it reminds me of why this point in time in NFL history is so fascinating to me, because it is magnanimous, and it is coming across it, and it is one of the most influential sports in America at this time, influential things in America. Its popularity is massive, and yet these players are making no money, right? The people who are doing the actual things are making no money. You're very anti-union, and there's no support for the people that are doing any of this. And it is just why are people still choosing to do this, right? And it's just fascinating to me. You know, why are people choosing to play this sport? And Kramer attempts to give his answer, right, of, you know, there's this camaraderie and this love for the people that you're playing with, but I still have to question why, you know, why. But yeah, that is Instant Replay, Jerry Kramer. Fun, short. Yeah.